Good morning. I'm Melanie Villalobos, and I'm going to read this scripture today. It comes from Ruth 2:14 through 18. At mealtime, Boas said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boas gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Would you bow with me for prayer, please? Father, with the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So sorry I wasn't here last week. If you hadn't heard, we took the kids to Disney, and I'm excited to be back, definitely. Disney was fun. It was 3 days of very little sleep and walking all the time. I don't know how I can walk 14,000 steps in a day and still gain weight, but I did. It was really delicious. There was food everywhere. It was great, and I came back and I stepped on the scale, and I was like, "Ooh, that is not a blessing at all." It was not good. But I hear that Pastor Lupina did a great job at introducing our Ruth series to you. Now we are in week 6. We are at the halfway point of our 12-week sermon series on impacting San Antonio and the people of Northern Hills through love, hospitality, discipleship, and challenge. And I actually really like the book of Ruth for that sermon series. The reason I like it so much is because there's just so rich, there's such a richness inside the book of Ruth for what's going on. And chapter 1, I hear you talked about last week, you talked about Ruth and Naomi and that amazing concept of discipleship of I will go where you go and your God will be my God. I really love that line from Ruth. That is the best summary of what discipleship is. Now today we're in chapter 2 and we're talking about Ruth, and we're introduced to this guy named Boas, and we're talking about hospitality. And so there's 4 things I'm going to talk to you about hospitality today, 4 aspects of it, and I'm going to give them to you right from the beginning. It's that hospitality shares, hospitality sacrifices, hospitality thinks ahead, and hospitality preserves the dignity of the recipient. But before we jump all the way into our Bible passage, I'd like to tell you a story. It was 8:30 on a Tuesday. I was a seminary student, and I was interning at a college across the street. There's Asbury Seminary, and there's Asbury College. I was attending the seminary and working at the college as an intern, and I was an intern in their adventure program. Now, that program basically meant that I led folks through the ropes course, did some hiking, did some camping, a little rock climbing, rappelling. One time we did like spelunking, which is went into a cave. I'll never do it again. It was terrifying. But then I had this other job, this other assignment was to update their climbing room. So they had this room that was basically just a closet underneath some stairs, and they had thrown a couple of rock climbing handholds onto these bricks, and they said, "Oh, it's a rock climbing gym." And it was pretty pathetic, actually. So my job was to update it. Now, my boss, Andy, wanted me to just put up more handholds. And I was like, actually, no, what we need to do is update the area and make it more aesthetically pleasing so that more students will actually use it, and maybe we can get a budget for it. Because my budget for the improvement of the gym was 0, which is kind of tough to improve anything with a budget of nothing. So I basically was hanging out. It was like a Tuesday. It was 8:30. I was kind of done for my work that day, so I was just kind of watching television. And I get this call from Andy, my boss and the director, and he's like, "Patrick, they just finished replacing the carpet in the president's house, and they threw all the old carpet in a dumpster. It'd be perfect for the climbing gym. Go get it." It's like, okay. So I threw on some shoes and drove just really across the street to this dumpster that was right next to the president's house. And I look at it, and there's like carpet kind of hanging out all over it. They didn't really throw it in very neatly. And so at first, I pull out a couple pieces, and I realize that they're small and they're not going to work. So I made the choice, and the choice was this. I had to go into the dumpster. So climbed into the dumpster, and I'm looking for pieces. I'm pulling up pieces, trying to see if pieces are big enough for this climbing gym, trying to unroll. And there's two things I realized. One, that carpet is really heavy. I don't think I understood how heavy it is until I tried to lift it by myself out of a dumpster. But then the second is that carpet pads are the grossest thing ever. They're dusty, and they never get cleaned, and they rip apart in your hands. I mean, I still feel the dry dustiness of the carpet pad, just so gross. And so I'm banging around inside this dumpster, trying hard not to get covered in dumpster juice, because carpet's not the only thing in this dumpster. And I know you know what dumpster juice is, because we've all walked by a restaurant before. And so I'm getting some pieces that I think will work, and I'm trying to get more than I need because I might have to cut it and fit it into place. And it's probably getting to be about 9 o'clock. And I think a class or something got out at about that time, or maybe the library closed. I don't know. But people started walking by, particularly girls started walking by, because the president's house is here, the dumpster's where I'm at, and the girls' dorms are like right there next to the president's house. So college girls are walking by, and apparently it's not a common sight to see a seminary student in a dumpster, because I get some looks, not good looks. I get one look of, oh, that poor guy who's in a dumpster looking for something. I get several looks of, I have pepper spray, don't mess with me. And then I get a few of, wow, that's really gross looks. However, one look I didn't get was the, hey, that guy's kind of cute at all. Nobody looked at that. Apparently, dumpster diving is not an activity that attracts college girls. Who would have thunk it? That's the case. Now, I tell you that story because gleaning, what Ruth was doing in our Bible passage, that was the closest I'd ever been to understanding what gleaning was. Gleaning is defined as basically just trying to scavenge and hunt for things that have value but are small and hard to find, and that is gleaning. Now, in the Bible, gleaning has a place in Levitical law. It was also supported by some things that were customary. So one of the things that would happen is if you were a landowner or a harvester, you would leave the corners of your field unharvested. The corners were for gleaners, and that was a way of taking care of those who were poor and destitute in the society. Is you would just leave the corners, and they could come out and harvest that grain themselves. The second part of that was anything that was left on the ground after the harvesters came through was also ripe for the taking. So if it was forgotten, if it was discarded, or it was just looked over or left behind, then a gleaner could come and gather it up. Now there's rules that applied to this practice. One of the rules was a harvester or a owner of a field could not benefit from the gleaners. He could not charge them. He could not ask them to do any work for him. They were on their own, but also he could not ask them to help him. The second is that he could not help them. So an owner of a field or harvester could not ask them for help and could not help them glean. Gleaning was their process, and they did it. and a field owner was not allowed to really help them. And the last is, we know this is mostly happened in the Holy Land. We also have some evidence that it happened in Babylon while the folks were in exile. But it was only mandated that you allow Israelites to glean. A foreigner, you did not have to allow. Now, Ruth is one of our main sources that say that maybe they allowed others who were in their community to glean if they weren't Israelites. But at the same time, we know that as a Levitical law, you did not have to, like you did in Israelite, let them glean. So, as Ruth was gleaning that day, and trust me, gleaning is hard work, we know that Boaz noticed her. So earlier in chapter 2, we see that Boaz noticed her and asked his harvesters about her. Now, as Pastor Lupina told you last week, that when Ruth decided to follow Naomi back to the Holy Land, out of Moab, it caused a little bit of stir in Bethlehem, in the community that Boaz was a figure in. It was odd that she would follow and devote herself to her mother-in-law and leave her land. So when Boaz asked his harvesters, hey, who is that lady over there? Now, we don't know why she noticed her. We don't know why he noticed her. Maybe she was young. Maybe it's because she was a Moabite. But he noticed her. He asked his folks, and they said, no, that's Ruth, the Moabite, who followed Naomi, her mother-in-law. She's the daughter-in-law of Elimelech, who passed away, and she is here gleaning. Now, that reputation preceded Ruth and obviously impressed Boaz. Because that's where we catch up with our scriptures today, that Boaz invites her over to lunch. Now, what do we know about Boaz? Well, just from this scripture alone, we can tell a little bit. The thing that we can't tell that you should know is that Boaz was kind of a big guy as far as he's a big wig. Like, his family was a known family. They were an honored family. They were a family of means and a family of leadership. And Boaz was a wealthy guy. He owned fields. And also we know that Boaz was with his harvesters. So a person in Boaz's position could send his harvesters out and hang out all day in his house or in his tent and just let his harvesters take care of everything. He wasn't doing that. It shows us the caliber of person he was, that he was even in the fields harvesting with his people, eating lunch with them. And it shows us even more about who he is, that he invites Ruth to come and share their meal. As Pastor Lupina told you last week, those from Moab are considered less than when it comes to the people of Israel. So the idea that the owner of the field and this leader would invite Ruth over to sit with him was kind of big. Now he shares with her what he has, which is basically just bread, a vinegar dip, which you've probably had something similar if you had Italian dressing, you're kind of close to it. Just vinegar and oil, just to give the bread some flavor, and then also some roasted grain. And they eat, and she has some leftover, and she packs it up. And then he commands his harvesters, hey, a couple things. One, let her pull from the sheaves. Now, the sheaves is basically anything outside the corners that is about to be harvested. Don't rebuke her if she does, because if a regular gleaner kind of moved out beyond the corners, because corners is not very well defined, then the harvesters could rebuke them and say, no, you get back to the corner. That's your stuff. This is our grain for our master, or it's ours. And then finally he says, no, but also do more than that. Pull the grain out of the bundles and leave for her. That's big, because that, all of it, from the eating lunch to the not rebuking her to the pulling grain out, is above and beyond. It was not normal, was not customary, it was not expected of Boaz to do these things. My thoughts are that he recognized that Ruth was not just gleaning for herself, but was gleaning for Naomi and desired to help her out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, because I want to switch our focus over to Ruth real fast. Ruth had got up and started gleaning for her and her mother-in-law. And if you guys don't know, harvesting and gleaning is not easy. It's hard hard work. I've baled hay before, and I'm still sore up in here, like forever. Like just from baling hay. I hated it. It was dry. It was dusty. It was tiresome work. And harvesting is like that, and gleaning is even worse because you get less than you get from harvesting. You glean, and you have to bend down and pick up and check for stalks. And when you're harvesting, you have to cut and figure out all the things that you're going to do and all the grain. You don't have the means that harvesters have. You have less than that, and it's hard work. But we see that Ruth was working hard all day. And then in the afternoon, she was done with harvesting and started threshing. That tells us something also. That if Ruth was threshing right then, that she probably didn't have much food. She needed the grain immediately. Because the harvesters would tie the grain into bundles and they would let it dry so that the grains fell out more easily when she was threshing. But if she was doing it that day, that means she needed grain immediately because threshing is harder when grain is fresh. And so there's a couple ways that they thresh. One is they just hold up the stalks and they kind of hit it with sticks and let the grain fall out from the stalks. Other way if they do it is sometimes they'll do both practices and then they'll let it like shift through a mesh, and the good pieces of grain fall through the mesh and the chaff stays in the mesh, and then you empty it out and start the process all over again. That's a way of threshing the grain so that you have just the grain left. And that's actually not an easy process at all. Now, it says that she got an ephah. Does anybody know what an ephah is? No, nobody does. That's okay. An ephah is about 2/3 of a bushel, which I don't even know what a bushel is either. I had to look up like how much is a bushel, but I can tell you this: an ephah is 10 omers, and an omer is a weight of manna. So back in the days with Moses and picking up manna in the desert, an omer was enough manna for one man for one day. So if Ruth got an ephah, that means she got 10 omers, which would be enough food for her and Naomi for at least 5 days. And if they stretched it out, maybe they could get 7 or 8, possibly 10 days of grain out of this process. But here's the deal. If you're a gleaner, and you're a really good gleaner, like professional gleaner, and you had to tell the story about the best gleaning day you've ever had, you would get a half an ephah, tops. Like tops. That would be the best day. That would be the day that you tell your friends about years later. I gleaned a day, and I got half an ephah, and it was amazing. Ruth doubled that for the full ephah of grain, enough for several days. Now, we don't know, one would probably say that it's probably also because Ruth worked hard, but also because of the blessing that Boaz gave to her. One, letting the things fall on the ground, and also letting her pull from the sheaves, not just the corners and what's on the ground. And those are the blessings that Boaz gave to her. At the beginning of our conversation here, I told you that hospitality has 4 aspects that we're going to talk about. That hospitality shares, hospitality sacrifices, hospitality thinks ahead, and hospitality preserves the dignity of those who receive it. So let's see how this plays out. We have both Boaz to Ruth, but we also have a second area of hospitality that we see, and that's Ruth to Naomi. So let's talk about hospitality shares. Hospitality shares because Boaz shares what he has for lunch. He shares it with Ruth, and we see that happening. But we also see Ruth sharing what she has with Naomi. Hospitality sacrifices. Boaz doesn't just sacrifice half his lunch. He also sacrifices grain that is his, grain that he's going to sell or use to feed his household for the year. And he lets Ruth pull from the sheaves, and he commands his men to throw down good, bundled up grain so that she can pick it up. Hospitality thinks ahead. We know that Boaz knew about Naomi, and Naomi was his relative. Knew that Naomi was Elimelech's widow. And he thought ahead and says, if I can supply grain to Ruth, or help Ruth get grain, then she can take it on to Naomi. And lastly, hospitality preserves the dignity of the recipients. And this was my favorite one. The reason Boaz just doesn't give Ruth the grain that's already been threshed and ready to go, instead has his guys pull out stalks from the bundle and leave them down, is because if someone was gleaning, it was not necessarily charity. It wasn't like they were a beggar on the streets. If a gleaner was gleaning, the grain that they took home was theirs by their own sweat of their brow. He provided a way for, in that society it was very important, that gleaners were not just people who survived off the charity of others. He provided a way for Ruth to earn that grain, but it still gave a way and figured out a way for her to earn the grain as they put it on the ground. So he gave her more, but at the same time made a way for her to do it herself, preserving her dignity, not just for her sake, but for her reputation amongst the community. And we'll talk a little bit more about that reputation amongst the community that Boaz is thinking about next week. Because next week we're talking about Boaz and Ruth again, and we're talking about a concept called the kinsman redeemer or the guardian redeemer, which Boaz is for the family. Now, every week I give you a challenge. This week I'm giving you two. The first is to find a way to practice hospitality this week underneath the four requirements that I've given you. That hospitality shares, hospitality sacrifices, hospitality thinks ahead, and hospitality preserves dignity. The good news for you is that this challenge, if you decide to undertake it, can be a very, very fun challenge, particularly if the person that you're thinking of giving this hospitality to is not expecting it, and even more fun, doesn't know who it came from. But then I have a second challenge for you. This one's a lot more fun, and it's about next week. If you have never seen this movie, it happened in 1971. It's called Fiddler on the Roof. It's a story of a Jewish milkman in Russia and his daughters who he has to marry off. And there's one of my favorite songs in it is called Matchmaker. If you have a chance to see Fiddler on the Roof this week, I recommend it. If you don't have a chance to see it, because it is like 2.5 hours long, it's quite a bit, and it's not easy to find, just Google search the video of Fiddler on the Roof, Matchmaker, and watch the song of Tabier's three daughters singing about a matchmaker, because next week we're talking about love and how Naomi plays a little bit of a matchmaker in that society. So those are your two challenges this week. I hope you will undertake them. If you wouldn't mind bowing with me for prayer.